So I am with catamaran designer Richard Woods. We've had a few conversations already about a variety of topics. So today we're going to be talking about monohulls versus catamarans and some of the attributes that make catamarans especially nice for cruising and living on. So Richard, I'm going to go with the assumption that you design catamarans because you think they've got some definite benefits. So do you want to sort of start off on what your thinking is as far as why they make good places to sail and live?
Well, I think it's fairly self-evident that the catamaran has a lot more interior room and a lot more deck space. And that seems to be the main appeal to people these days. We've actually been 20 years cruising on catamarans, and we only recently moved ashore to a house. It's a very nice, comfortable two-bedroom house. It's 800 square feet. Now, a 40-foot by 25-foot catamaran is 1,000 square feet. So even a 40-foot catamaran is huge compared to the size of house that most people live in. Then there's so that's the basic thing, space. But then you've got several more factors, one being privacy. And everyone wants to have their own private space. And you can do that very easily with nearly all catamarans because you can put a bunk in each corner and live in the middle, essentially. And each bunk is a private space. Whereas you compare that to a monohull and essentially everyone's living in the middle. Now, both of us, you and I, have done a lot of sailing on monohulls, so we do know how to compare. And the last time I did any long distance sailing on a monohull, any time on board, was from the US down to Cabo San Lucas and Mexican Baja on a Maple Leaf 48 Canadian flag, and I'm sure you're familiar with that boat.
Yeah.
And that was obviously a big, comfortable, effectively a motor sailor. And afterwards, I started comparing it to the 32-foot catamaran that we had, the Eclipse, which is obviously a lot shorter. But what was the real differences when you're living on board? The Maple Leaf had 2 double cabins, and we lived together in the middle, and a shower compartment at each end. Well, the Eclipse had 3 double cabins and a big shower compartment. And then, so they were much the same. And then the low carrying, we both had we had a sewing machine, a solid dinghy, all the tools we needed and so on. And that was from comparing a 48-foot big monohull, in effect, to a 32-foot boat. And we spent quite some time with 6 people on board, family and friends, on the 32-foot catamaran. So you don't need to have that big a boat as a catamaran when compared to a monohull, which has lots of other advantages, which we've really talked about before. Yeah. So privacy is a major factor. And then there's several more things.
One thing that comes to mind when you're talking about that, the voyage down to Cabo San Lucas, I know for us, when we travel on our boat, we travel in the cabin where we both can see all the time. And to me, that was almost a safety factor because it didn't, we weren't just sort of popping out into the cockpit now and again to look around. We were looking around all the time. So visibility strikes me as important.
Yeah, that was my next point that I was going to make, is that there's the two things, particularly if we're talking about livable cruising boats. You either live at anchor or you're sailing, and most of the time you're living at anchor. And therefore, in effect, you're a floating cottage. And no one goes out and buys a basement apartment. They all buy the penthouse suite if they can. And the reason for that is you've got the view. Whereas with a monohull, you go down below and you can't see out. And that's a major drawback when you're gone to your anchorage like the one in the photograph behind us there, which is the Harmony Islands, quite near you, in British Columbia. And you want to be able to see the view now you've sailed there. So it's crazy that you have a boat where you have to go down below. And I think that's one of the other differences is that you say on a catamaran you go inside, and on a monohull you go down below. And then I agree entirely about this from the sailing point of view, because one of the things that I remember from a personal point of view is sitting inside, crossing the Bay of Biscay in November, going to windward, 45 knots of wind, so in a basically a gale, sitting below and steering with the autopilot, remote control on the autopilot, but being able to see out all round. I didn't have to go out on deck to stay on watch. I could do that from inside. So yeah, all round visibility is a really important thing to do, and that's one of the other big advantages of the catamaran over a monohull. And then there's a third factor, which is the fact that a catamaran doesn't roll, and it basically stays up or heel, and it stays upright all the time. And that's a surprising thing. If you're new to sailing altogether and you go on a monohull and it heels over, you don't like it, and then you get used to it. But on a catamaran, when it's just staying level all the time, that's such a huge advantage and makes the boat so much more comfortable than any monohull can be. And someone a long time ago said multi-hull sailing is no bruising cruising. And that is definitely it. You're not holding on all the time. You're not heeling rather, you're not trying to stop yourself falling over when the boat's heeling, when you're down below cooking. You can open the fridge door on either tack. You don't need the gimbaled stove. All those sorts of things just make life so much easier and more comfortable. And although you say, okay, most of the time you're actually at anchor, or rather, most of the time you're actually not sailing. And a lot of monohull people go into marinas because they know that if they go out and anchor, the boat's going to roll. I remember, this is going back years ago, I used to crew on a 70-foot charter monohull in the Caribbean, and it had portholes in the topsides. And one time we had to close the portholes because the boat was rolling with portholes under. And it seemed a fairly gentle swell, but the boat just started rolling all the time. And it was miserable. And you don't get that. And so that's why people go into a marina, because, we won't roll. Whereas if you don't hold an anchor, you can stay out there.
There is a different motion on a catamaran, though, that I did find I needed to get used to, and that's sort of that quick, almost a jerky roller skatey sensation. And I get seasick, and a lot of people who get seasick do choose catamarans for the reason to, one, have that visibility all the time, because that helps with seasickness, but also to avoid the roll. But that sort of faster, jerky motion can also aggravate it a little bit. So is that characteristic of all catamarans, or we were on a particularly light one?
No, it is a common problem because it's a light boat moving relatively fast and bouncing along. And it's the comparison I make is that if you go in a bus, that stays upright all the time. But when you walk down the aisle as it's coming up to a stop, you hold onto the handrails because it's moving around. And that's the same with the catamaran, that it is moving around. And that's one of the things that I don't like about a lot of particularly the more modern, which are catamarans, which have a lot of empty space. And even though essentially flat and level. As you say, you're bouncing around and you want to be able to put your hand out to a handrail or a handhold inside and move across the boat. And what you certainly don't want to have is the possibility of falling onto a sharp cornered table, for example, which is nice and easy for a CNC machine to make and cut and glue it, do it all automatically, but it's not very good for you once you're on the boat. Having the traditional rounded curved corners and handhelds is still really sensible seaman-like thing to do.
Yes, I do have to say that sailing a monohull for a lot of years and then a catamaran, I tended to have a lot more bruises and boat bites, we called them, from the monohull than I ever got from the cat. So I think there was a difference in motion. The one challenge we really had as well was temperature control. The monohull is sort of one space, it's getting equally heated and cooled. The catamaran had a lot of uneven temperatures. Because, you know, you're for a lot of reasons. So do you want to talk a little bit about temperature control and what your thoughts might be?
No, there's the two things that always go with that. There's the heat control and the cold control. And one of the things that people had going back a few years is that it had saloon windows that were all sloping, and then they had a very bad greenhouse effect. And it was when the Lagoon 38 came out in the late 90s with vertical windows, and people thought that looked really horrible, and high windage and so on, which of course it is. But it did reduce the greenhouse effect and kept the cabins cooler. So that's one thing. The other thing is, yes, the hot air rises, and so if you've got a saloon, and heating in the saloon is basically not possible to heat the hulls as well. And so you tend to have the saloon, your living area, hot, and you go down into your bunk and it's cold and miserable and damp. And that's one of the real advantages of having an open deck boat where you do only have the accommodation in the house, because you can heat each hull just like a monohull, and I've had customers who've done exactly that. That's the reason they've chosen to have an open deck boat. And so what we had on our Eclipse was a solid fuel stove, but I had it mounted down in the hull with the chimney basically going up through the saloon. And that was a sort of a compromise. And we did spend Christmas, a long time ago, Christmas on board with ice on deck. And then even going back even further in the early 80s, we had an open deck boat. So yeah, living in the hulls, but we had 6 inches of snow on board. Which was, it's okay keeping it warm, but you've got to go out and get from one hull to the other.
Right.
It's fairly miserable. So the real only sensible answer is central heating, blown air central heating.
I thought you were going to say stay in the tropics, but
well, stay in the tropics. But then on the other hand, you've got the heat problem. And what I found that the most effective way of cooling a saloon is having the front windows opening hatch in the front. That's far better than having hatches in the cabin roof, which sounds a bit surprising, but that's what we found, having put hatches in the roof, thinking, well, that's going to let the hot air out and so on. It's actually just getting the airflow blowing through is much better. And then being able to have the companionway door open. And one of the things on that is that I've always tried to have a stable door so that I could close the bottom half and still have the top open. Because one of the other things about going back to the comfort and livability of a catamaran over a monohull is that, as we said earlier, that you don't want to be down in the basement. And so so you tend to stay in the cockpit a lot on a monohull, and that's not private. Particularly if you're in the Mediterranean and you met more and you're tied to the quay wall and everyone's looking into your cockpit. And whereas on a multi-hull, you can tend to stay inside in the cabin and you've got a bit more privacy. So having the stable door means you keep the bottom half shut and the top open, and that gives you some privacy. But you have to make sure that you have very good mosquito screens.
Yes, yeah.
For a lot of places.
That's very true. So thank you so much for talking about catamarans versus monohulls. Really a lot of good details there to think about